Louis H. Lapham, author of The Wish for Kings, Democracy at Bay. You have a chapter called Versailles on the Potomac. What's it about?
It's about the splendor of Washington that has been the magnificence of its marble, of its pretensions, of its bureaucratic vastness, so that it has become like a palace at Versailles. I mean, and it is a court society, a world unto itself, sometimes called inside the Beltway. And it's grown and multiplied since the end of the Second World War, so that the expense of government, the number of functionaries, of people who serve government in its many facets. I mean, I think there's something like now 100,000 lawyers and lobbyists that work on various degrees of regulation, and the Congress, the staff of the Congress has multiplied to 35,000, and it's this sense of a vast Versailles-like court, a hall of mirrors in which the various servants of government flatter one another or blame one another, strike poses, issue bills, make announcements, stage pageants of one kind or another. That's the view of it in that chapter.
You have a story in here about Robert Mosbacher, the former Secretary of Commerce.
I do. When Mosbacher first came to, he was appointed by Bush, and he came from Houston, and he thought that a man of his stature and magnificence should have had more notice by the media, more time on television, more space in the Washington Post, and so on. And so he was constantly seeking means of his own self-aggrandizement, and he hit upon having a private entrance made for himself at the Department of Commerce on the other side of the building from the entrance in which the mere populace was to come and go, and he had the entrance built at great expense with a long awning, sort of like a canopy in front of a nightclub or a restaurant. And I think he wanted to have it red because Jim Baker's canopy at the State Department was blue, or he wanted it blue because Jim Baker's canopy was red. I can't remember which way it went. But there were only 6 people allowed to use that entrance. There was Mosbacher himself, his wife, his secretary, his deputy, his lawyer, for all I know, his valet. And then, after he'd gotten that all together, it still wasn't quite grand enough. He practiced walking in and out of that entrance for a number of weeks, and then he decided that still, once he got inside the building, there was a distance to go to his own private elevator. But between the entrance and the elevator, there were offices, sort of cubicles, in which the poor people wore shirt sleeves. I mean, it was an unseemly display of manual labor. So he had the entire inside of the Department of Commerce, that part of it anyway, reconstructed. The offices were moved so that there was a properly open, grand space between the entrance and the elevator. And I believe that there was a table put there with simply a decoration of flowers. But it's that kind of attitude that too often captures people. I mean, not only, of course, in Washington, but elsewhere within any organization large enough to sustain its own theory of reality.
Nancy Reagan, the color red, and a bed?
She used to have her own bed, or a replica. When she traveled with the president, she would have her own bed, or one exactly like it, carried a few days before she was going to arrive in some foreign capital. And she also was in love, as you probably well remember, the color red was a passion of hers, so that the rooms in which she was to stay, whether she was going to a palace in Venice or a castle in France or a hotel in Hawaii, the room was painted red prior to her arrival. And her bed was placed, the room was painted. And then the mirrors were all dropped because Nancy Reagan was fairly short. And sometimes the mirrors had to be brought down to a level that didn't, so she saw more than the top of her head, which would otherwise put her in a bad mood for the afternoon.
Jack Kent Cooke, who owns the Washington Redskins, you quote him as saying, "I'm a Republican, but strangely I have a great many Democratic friends. Dodd, Brzezinski, Greenspan. He's of indeterminate lineage. Sam Donaldson, what's he? Gene McCarthy and George McGovern. What's the point here?"
The point is that Jack Kent Cooke is the owner of the Washington Redskins, and that one of the most valued places at court in Washington is in Jack Kent Cooke's box at RFK Stadium. And it's a large box. I believe there are 50 or 60 places in it. And of course, during the long period of the Republican administration, the box was filled with important Republicans. And shortly after the election of Clinton, I believe within 2 days, suddenly it turned out Cooke discovered all of his Democratic friends, and their seats were changed. And with a new administration, the court brings in new courtiers, and Cooke was very quick to see that. It's the constant game in Washington, as you know far better than I, of who's in, who's out. I mean, who will come, who will go, who will get to write the senator's speeches or carry the general's shirt or sit in Jack Kent Cooke's box or have a parking space at the National Airport. I mean, these are questions of vast weight.
You also quote Mr. Cooke as saying, "The box is not used to ingratiate myself with the administration. Please quote me," this is the New York Times actual quote, "please quote me precise on that. I invite people who are good company, happy, cheerful, good-humored people who love football."
It's a great statement. It's worthy of a politician, but I mean, I'm sure you can always, people who are in Jack Kent Cooke's box are apt to be happy and cheerful and loving football almost of necessity. I mean, that would be whether they're Democrats or Republicans.
You write about the World Bank and first class versus business class travel. What's the World Bank, by the way?
The World Bank is a large lending institution which arranges loans, usually for underdeveloped countries, loans for economic assistance. And it takes, most of the funds come from the United States, and the headquarters of the World Bank are here in Washington, but it does assemble funds from other countries in the world. And so its mission is to the poorer, more hard-pressed countries of the earth. But it sustains a fairly sizable bureaucracy of its own, very comfortable one, very highly paid people. And one of these people on one of his jaunts to some desolate heath in Africa had figured out that if he traveled business class instead of first class, he would save a great deal of money. And he then worked out the equation that if this practice was adopted by other members of the hierarchy of the World Bank, they would save $12 million a year. And this is not too great a decline in accommodation. I mean, we were simply going from first class to business class and saving $12 million. But when this memorandum was passed around within the corridors at the World Bank, it evoked feelings of horror, disbelief, dismay. And one of the vice presidents sent back a counter memo saying, I can't remember the exact words, but it was to the effect that this sort of suggestion was outrageous, and that if Mr. Whoever it was didn't have more concern for the comfort of his colleagues, he should be dismissed at once and sent to some dark place of exile. But it was the feeling of, how can they take this away from me?
You have a story in here about Bob Gray. Who is he, and what's his relationship to you?
Bob Gray was a man I began to, when I first began I first came to Washington in the late 1950s during the Eisenhower administration. I'd come from university and I was trying to decide what kind of career to follow.
What school?
I'd gone to Yale University in the United States, then I'd gone to Cambridge University in England. And so I came and I talked as a very young man. I approached the CIA, I approached the Washington Post, and I also approached the White House. And I was sent to talk to Mr. Gray. Gray, at this point in time, eventually became an enormously successful lobbyist and trafficker in influence and patronage. And now, as I believe, he had his own lobbying firm for many years and is now with Hill and Knowlton. But then he was a young man and he was an aide to Eisenhower. And I can remember being interviewed by him. He had very little time. He was hard pressed, and the interview took place in the basement of the White House, in the barber shop. I mean, there was a barber chair down there in those days, and the only other place for me to sit was on the toilet. I sat on the toilet, and Gray sat in the barber chair, and I was at the level of his shoes, which I remember being very beautiful shoes. And I started to talk about democratic theory. I was very young, very idealistic, and Gray waved that all off and sort of said, please don't waste anybody's time. He said the whole thing about government, about Washington, about power is simply to acquire the right sort of friends and make connections and do what you're told until the great day comes when you can tell others what to do. Carry whatever water must be carried, and so on. It was a very realistic assessment and a very clear statement of the principle, which I never forgot. He made it very articulately.
What happened to Bob Gray after 1957?
He became, he then went into set up his own firm and became very influential in a number of, as a lobbyist, as a man who makes introductions, who arranges things, who helps legislation more easily through the channels of the Congress and so on. Lobbyist, I believe, is the term.
What happened to you?
What happened to me? I went into the newspaper business. I became a newspaper reporter, first for the San Francisco Examiner, and then for the New York Herald Tribune. And then I became a magazine writer in most of the 60s for the Saturday Evening Post and for Life magazine.
And then what?
Then I became a writer for Harper's Magazine in about 1970, and then in 1971 I became, by default, a managing editor, because there was one of those office politics things that happens in New York magazine offices fairly frequently. So the then editor resigned, so did some of the other editors. I didn't agree with their unhappiness. So I stayed, and I became, on a Monday I was a writer, and on a Tuesday I became a managing editor. And I remained, I was the managing editor for 4 years, and then I became the editor in 1976.
How long did you stay there?
Well, I was the editor for about, let's see, from 1976 to 1981. Then I was fired and spent 2 years in exile and rehired in 1983. I was then the glorious return. I was recalled as the editor of the magazine. So I've been the editor twice. Once 1976, 81, and again from 83 until now.
You dedicate this book to John R. MacArthur, who is wary of merchants, let alone kings. Who is John R. MacArthur?
John R. MacArthur is the publisher of Harper's Magazine and is related to the large MacArthur family, well-known family in Chicago. And he became associated with Harper's Magazine very early, when it, in 1980, became interested in the magazine. And it's a long story, but when the magazine went bankrupt in 1980, it was through his influence that the magazine was rescued, first by the John R. MacArthur Foundation, and then, in turn, by the Harper's Magazine Foundation. And he is, first of all, a journalist, and has himself written a good book called The Second Front, which he published last year, which is a book about the press coverage of the Gulf War. And then he's also the publisher of the magazine. But he's a very, very good person for me to work for, because he encourages freedom of expression. I mean, he's not nervous about offending the powers that be.
Where's the MacArthur money come from originally?
It originally comes from John R. MacArthur's grandfather, who was a man who made a great fortune in the real estate and in insurance businesses, and began to acquire his fortune in the Depression in the early 1930s.
In the middle of that period when you were without a job,
Yeah.
you had a dinner that you were invited to, that Giscard d'Estaing, the former president of France, to tell that story.
Well, I was, again, I'm trying to explain that the courtier spirit, the attitude of bowing and scraping that takes place in various large American institutions is true of, certainly in Washington, but it's also true of quite a few business corporations. It's true within the media. It's true in the universities.
Define the word courtier.
Courtier is one who says to a succession of masters, make of me what you want. I am what you want me to be. In other words, it's a toady, a dependent, somebody willing to do whatever is asked by his or her boss, and lives by making a constantly gracious impression. It's yes man would be another way of, that would be another phrase for it. Anyway, in 1981, I was the editor of the magazine, and I had been asked to a very small dinner at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York for Giscard d'Estaing. And I was invited, I believe, on the 1st of August, and then I was fired on the 15th of August. And the dinner was on the 15th of September, and a few days before the dinner, the council called me up and wanted to know what title should go after my name on the little piece of paper that's distributed to everybody at the dinner. And I, of course, by that time had none. And there's this long and ghastly silence, and I finally managed to resolve it by saying that I wrote an occasional article for the Washington Post, and so I didn't have any permanent employment with the Post, but it was enough to get on the piece of paper.
Would they have invited you if you didn't have a job?
It wouldn't have been, probably not, no. I mean, again, the notion of the court, the notion of titles, the notion of one is known by one's institutional affiliation, the plain democratic name, it has to have the of Mobil Oil Corporation, of the New York Times, of C-SPAN, of Harper's Magazine, of whatever. I mean, we as Americans like to pride ourselves as individualists constantly, and one of the images of ourselves that we like the best is that of the Clint Eastwood figure, or the man against the system, the cowboy faring west in the rain. But we, in fact, are people that are very much dependent upon our institutional identities and identifications. I am of the bank, I am of the paper, I am of the studio, whatever. And this, of course, is one of the premises or theses of the book, which is as the courtier spirit, which is the accommodating spirit. The democratic spirit is the one that simply speaks out and says whatever it's in its mind. And candor is one of the great democratic political virtues. We're Democrats to the extent that we try to tell each other what we know, what we've seen, what we feel. We're courtiers to the extent that we tell each other what each of us want to hear. And so the book is saying that as more and more people in this country become more and more dependent on large institutions, whereas in the last part of the 19th century, most Americans were self-employed, something like 80% of the population. Many of them farmers, obviously, but farmers and small craftsmen and businessmen. In the 20th century, as the large institutional organizations come forward, now I think only 2% of the American people are self-employed. And if one depends on an institution for one's whole existence, I mean, not only medical insurance, but also clothes allowance, also pension, also place in the world, also business card and so forth, then the independent habit of mind tends to give way to the more accommodating habit of mind. That's one of the arguments.
Note 6 in the back of the book, the story of Kissinger's life is the story of the perfect courtier.
Kissinger was a man who knew how to play the court world extremely well. I mean, he began as he was discovered by Nelson Rockefeller when he'd been Kissinger started as an academic. He was at Harvard, a history professor, I believe. And then somehow he managed to get to Nelson Rockefeller, and he provided Nelson Rockefeller with whatever theories. Nelson Rockefeller was then governor of New York and had presidential ambitions. And he provided him with theories of the Cold War, theories of nuclear disarmament, theories of nuclear exchange. I forget in what succession they came. But Kissinger, again, was a man always willing to arrange the world to fit the desire of his patron, whether it was Rockefeller or Nixon or sometimes important senior columnists in the media. I mean, he understood that it was a world of poses, of the right word at the right time. Whether the theory actually was true or not, whether it had any relation to the facts or not, was less important than the way it advanced or failed to advance Kissinger's career.
It's a little bit off the subject, but it's in your book, and it's note number 12. You talk about an advertising executive who had to give an enema to a client once a month, once a week. What in the world is that story?
That story is, I'm saying that as well, it's a story about, trying to put it delicately.
Is this new information, by the way, in this book?
No.
No, is this the first time it's been published, this little story?
Yeah. I mean,
you found this out?
A fellow explained this to me, yeah.
Well, tell the whole story, if you don't mind.
Well, it's a story, I mean, the magazine business, again, as people become more independent on their patrons, more willing to do what is ever necessary to do to get the vote or to get the part or to get the account. People who are in the position of granting those requests begin to have more and more refined desires and appetites. I mean, it's a variation on the old story about the Hollywood producer who insists that the young aspiring actress go to bed with him before she can get the part. In this instance, it's a story of a ad salesman who is dependent on a client for a very large account, a couple of $100,000 a year in business for the magazines in question. And the client had a weird sexual request, which required the advertising fellow to show up, I think, once every 2 months in a motel in somewhere in New Jersey and administer an enema to the gentleman. So,
and by the way, you say he had to wear a seersucker suit, a bow tie, either yellow or pink?
Yeah, he had. There were certain sartorial requirements. But it's an example of the, it happens to be a fairly unhappy example or dismal example, but there are many, many examples like that throughout the society. People that are in power, that have power over their dependents. This essentially was the argument between Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. It wasn't it was the argument about what does the individual in authority, what can he insist upon on the part of his subordinates.
You have a letter in here, I'll read just a little bit of it. Dear Mr. President, herewith the first run off the press of a book called The Making of the President, 1968, whose hero is Richard M. Nixon. Later on, you say, this gentleman says, the campaign that this book tries to describe was the campaign of a man of courage and of conscience, and the respect it wrung from me, which I hope is evident, surprised me week by week as I went along. Later, this man writes, there's so much difference between being a reporter and being a citizen, and his last line, and this president can also call on me as a friend. Sincerely, Teddy White.
Right.
Why did you put that in this book?
I put that in because I'm trying to show the relation of the media, the press, to power, which is, again, the relation of the courtier, trying to curry favor among the people whom it describes, to stay friends. I mean, in that particular book, White had some rather sharp things to say about Nixon, but he wanted to maintain his place at court. I believe this is true. I don't know if this is in the book, but I've been told, and I think it's true, is that Kay Graham in the Washington Post, shortly after Nixon was impeached, I mean the same month, sent him a nice note and said, don't worry, when it's all over, we'll have dinner. I mean, it's that relation. The relation is always to power. And if you're out of power, nobody can remember your name. And if you're in power, everybody's your best friend. The case of Nixon's career is a brilliant demonstration of that. I mean, a man who was considered a used car salesman, impeached, and now he's 20 years ago, his name was synonymous with scoundrel crook, and now his name is synonymous with statesman and philosopher.
The last line of the jacket on your book says, the several facets of this question come into brilliant focus in this important book by one of our most incisive social critics. No one who cares about the future of our nation should miss reading The Wish for Kings. They're writing about you. And the only reason I bring that up is that you then have a note in here that says, the talent for self-promotion is by no means unique to Washington. In New York, it is common practice for authors to write the jacket copy for their own books.
That's true.
Did you write the jacket copy for your own book?
I don't think so. I certainly edited it. I mean, what happens is that the publisher writes it, and then they submit it to the author. And so I'm sure I had a hand in that.
Did you worry about the fact that you had a hand in that and then used this footnote? Because you're critical of a guy named Gordon Lish, who wrote the following about himself. There is no other contemporary figure in the nation's literary community whose presence is as widely or as urgently felt.
I think it's a question of degree. I mean, it's a question. I thought the Lish was a little over the top. I thought the words that the publisher used on my own behalf were fairly cliched and familiar.
What about this book? It's published by
by Grove Press.
Is that owned by Harper's?
No, it's owned by the Atlantic Monthly. There's something called the Atlantic Monthly Press, and then there was something called Grove Press, and just about the same time that this book was published this spring, Atlantic Monthly Press acquired Grove Press, so now they're a joint publishing company.
Why did you want to write this book?
I wanted to write the book because I was trying to describe what I saw, not only I was trying to report accurately the circumstance of what I kept encountering. I mean, and again, it's not only about government, it's about universities, it's about corporations, about the media, and I don't exempt myself from the conditions that I describe, but people constantly go around and say the American democracy is in trouble, or the United States is in decline, and so forth. And it seems to me that if there's that may be true, but one of the reasons that is there is an absence of Democrats, small d. I mean, something is evolving in this country, and has been over the last 20 years, away from the notion of democratic self-government, and even more to the point, a loss of faith in the democratic idea. I mean, freedom is good, but it's not enough. Self-government would be wonderful if we had the time and the energy and the resources to practice it, but in the meantime, give us somebody who will take care of us. That's the wish for kings. The wish for kings is a very old wish. It's the wish that brings in Caesar. It's the wish that brings in the man on the white horse, the magical figure that will resolve all one's troubles. And it is antithetical to the democratic notion of discovering one's own future.
You write, I have come across only a small number of people who can talk about any particular book at convincing length.
That is true in New York. New York is, that's a remark, I believe, about the New York literary world, where the conversation is much more apt to be about the author's standing in the market. I mean, everybody has read the reviews, and everybody knows whether the book is up or down or in or out, and everybody has something to say about it in a couple of sentences. But I find, at least within the court world of the New York literary scene, that relatively few people have had the time to read all the way through the book. I find that when I travel around the country, that if I'm in California or if I'm in Ohio or Texas, and I run across somebody who's read the book, they're apt to have read the whole thing and are prepared to really talk about it. Whereas in New York, I get the current opinion.
You had a book show on television.
I did.
What was the name of it?
It was called Bookmark, and it was on public broadcasting, and it was on for 3 years, 1989, 90, 91, I believe.
What was the format?
Very similar to this one, except it went for half an hour. We'd take a book, just the way we're doing now, and I would play your part, and you would play mine, and then often I would have one or two other people in the conversation, usually writers, who had thought about or had written about the subject who could add to the conversation. And either argue with the writer or provide a different perspective. And the object was to try to get a conversation about ideas going in a half an hour.
If you still had the show and you were playing my role and you had somebody else sitting at the table for this book, what kind of person would you invite?
Well, you'd have to, I might ask somebody like Hedrick Smith. Hedrick Smith wrote a book called The Power Game. And published a very interesting book, came out, I think, 4 years ago, and he, well-known figure in Washington. This would be, certainly from the Washington side, this would be a very familiar topic to him, and he would agree with some of it and argue with some of it. But again, he's very good on television. I mean, he would have been an interesting presence, I think.
What happened to the show?
The show lost its funding. I mean, it was supported by the Bell Atlantic Telephone Company, and they supported that company for 3 years, and then the people who had been responsible for that within Bell Atlantic went to other companies. The new people in the Bell Atlantic had no interest in it, and I couldn't raise money for it. I tried. It at that point was running in 147 stations. It was beginning to evolve and was beginning to acquire an audience. And but I went to various corporations. I went to some foundations, but I never could find the money to put it back on.
What do you think of public television? And how does that fit in because I know you write some about it in The Wish for Kings.
Yeah. I think public television, in my experience of it, was very much part of the court world. In other words, they had certain people I came up against had certain set attitudes. I mean, I brought the book show first to the station in Washington, and I was simply told that we here at the station, we're not interested in books. We never want to hear more than 3 minutes a day of a book review on NPR, and we appreciate your concern, but no. And this was even with the funding presented to them. I mean, I went to that meeting with the people from Bell Atlantic. And then we encountered the same thing when we tried to put the show on through Philadelphia. And New York was willing to take the show, but only if we dressed it up with production values. So I encountered hostility to books, to ideas on the part of PBS. I mean, this kind of show would be considered talking heads, and therefore not interested, not good for ratings, not show business. And I encountered that attitude almost wherever I went within PBS. I think they're wrong, because I happen to like talking heads, and I think they're interesting, and I also think that the public broadcasting system should try to do more of this kind of thing, because, as you know, there are a lot of interesting people in the country, and they have a lot of interesting things to say, and not enough of them appear either on, certainly not on the networks, and not enough on the public broadcasting system.
I've underlined a couple of other comments you're making here about some individuals. I just want to read them and get your reaction as to why you said that. The Television and Publishing Media Award, I'm reading this wrong, the Television and Publishing Media award Alan Dershowitz the reputation of an incomparable trial lawyer in homage to his talent for publicity rather than in recognition of his record in appeals cases, which as of the summer of 1992 stood at 9 wins and 39 losses.
Yes, the tendency again is to go for the reputation. Dershowitz is a great self-promoter. He has won some spectacular cases, but he has lost more than he has won. But people like, I believe, Leona Helmsley and then Mike Tyson both were persuaded by his reputation. And both of them went more or less directly to jail, as I remember. I mean, he didn't triumph in their cases. But again, the media image, the reputation, often is a surrogate for the work itself. I mean, again, take Kissinger and take Nixon. Both of them have still reputations as prescient statesmen, people who were clear-eyed and saw the shape of the world. And yet, if you look back on their record, it's like Dershowitz's record. I mean, they were wrong on Vietnam. They didn't understand the oil crisis of the early 70s. They certainly didn't understand Iran or the Shah. They didn't foresee the change in Russia. Neither of them ever understood the economy. They didn't understand what it would mean to go off to change the gold standard in the early 70s. So that the record is based on, to a large extent, on image and very little on substance.
Elizabeth Taylor. But the media chatter incessantly about the people for whom the society has the least use, about Elizabeth Taylor's wedding or Jay Leno's contract or Maria Shriver's hair. And they, let me turn the page, and they take little notice of people or professions on whom the society utterly depends. How come?
The former figures, the celebrity figures, tend to be more fun. I mean, they can be brilliantly illuminated. They provide gossip. They're decorative. I mean, to keep celebrities in a way is like keeping pets. I mean, they're expensive, but they relieve people of their own grief or their own concerns. It's like a great puppet show that takes place, or it's like a pageant at court, to get back to that image. It's like a masked ball, and these people are more fun to talk about, and again, with the wonders of the modern technology, with the television, people throughout the country identify with them. I mean, the stars of afternoon television soap opera shows receive 100,000 letters a week from fans telling them things that the correspondents would never tell their fathers, wives, husbands. You know, I mean, confessional.
You write about a dinner party you were in attendance, and you're sitting next to a lady and you're talking about democracy. Before I ask you about that, let me read this statement you write. Over the course of the last 20 years and across the span of an extensive acquaintance among the people who enjoy most of the country's advantages, bond salesmen and politicians, as well as publishers, corporate vice presidents, novelists, lawyers, English professors, and undersecretaries of state, I have noticed that most of the respondents fear and despise both the theory and the practice of democracy.
I think that's true. I'm talking about, it's the thing I said earlier when I said that if you asked me, why did I write this book? The answer is that I've encountered, if you ask me what is the trouble with the American democracy, I will say to you the absence of Democrats in small d.
They despise it, though?
I think they fear it. Maybe in certain people despise it. I mean, the attitude of the despising takes the form of the superior judgment and taste, let's say, of either New York or Washington. We happy few, we here in New York, understand it. But they, on the other side of the Allegheny Mountains, won't understand it. Or we happy few here in Washington know what is meant by, but they won't know what is meant by. Sorry?
What about that lady? I mean, the lady at the party kind of dovetails with what you just said.
Yes, I'm not sure which lady.
She's the one that I found myself wondering how it is possible to preserve the democratic spirit in a society distinguished by the absence of Democrats. At a dinner in Washington in February, I was seated next to a woman who thought that democracy was supposed to be easy, quiet, orderly, peaceful, and safe.
Right. That's true.
By the way, you didn't name some of these people. They're going to know who they are when they read this.
I would think so.
You going to be invited back to these dinners, you think?
I have no idea. Maybe. But again, that woman's sort of thought in terms of democracy as a 4th of July parade, not as a ceaseless argument. And again, the attitude toward please no confrontation. Democracy is about confrontation. It's about you and I disagreeing with each other. It's about, it's not easy, it's not orderly, it's not especially safe. And the language of the court, the language of people who despise the vulgarity of too sharp an opinion or too garish a taste, say, don't want to argue. You know, this woman, you know, was amazed to discover that that individual property rights could sometimes actually be in conflict with community rights. I mean, this came to her as a great news. And when I say despise, and when I say few Democrats, then you have to look at the instinct all over the country to sort of withdraw into enclaves. Take the city of Los Angeles, where you have the people in Bel Air or in Pasadena or in Beverly Hills living behind safe perimeters, behind walls, behind their own police forces, just trying to divorce and distance themselves from the proletarians wandering in the streets. Now that's happening all across the country. The whole advertising business is based on the point of making class distinctions.
In the time remaining, I think one of the things is you dish it out to just about everybody in here on both sides, and I want to make sure I get the balance. You say Bill Clinton cast himself as a friend of the American victim. The promises he made in the name of a custodial state could easily have been confused with a program of diet and exercise for a generation of lost children. An abbreviated list of his promises reads as follows, and you go through all of his promises. And earlier you said the philosophers of the liberal left, several of whom composed Governor Clinton's thesis of economic deliverance, believe that although money is wicked in the hands of mere individuals, it regains its blessedness in the hands of the state.
Yes. That's the both left and right believe that money is wonderful if only properly used. I mean, the conservative is apt to think that it's best left to the individual with no government regulation or rules, and the statist, the person who says the government knows best, and therefore if we spend the money on behalf of others, it's a different use, but it's in either instance money is blessed only in the hands of those in the hands of the right people, however they happen to be defined.
Is there any way to define your own politics at this stage in your life? After reading this book, did you conclude anything?
I conclude that...
I mean, writing this book, excuse me.
Well, I conclude that I want to get on, I want to try to learn how to describe the circumstances of the American democracy at this point in time in a language that's more accurate than the one we've been using. I mean, one of our difficulties in this country is we don't have a vocabulary yet in which we can accurately tell each other what we want. I mean, how do you solve, what are the words to solve, let's say, the healthcare crisis? There is no solution until we can come to a prior agreement as to what we expect. I mean, otherwise, the desire for immortality, I mean, we now spend $600 billion a year, or 7% of our GNP, and that will just continue. I mean, we will bankrupt ourselves because we will, the desire to stay immortal. I mean, how are we going to control that desire, that urge, unless we come to some prior agreement as to what we're about?
Are you a liberal or a conservative?
Well, I would say I was culturally a conservative, but I tend to be politically a liberal. I mean, I have elements of both in them.
Do you have a favorite president?
You mean other than Lincoln and Jefferson? Okay. They would be they're the ones I probably know.
What do you think of the Kennedy legacy?
I think it was, again, it's part of the wish for kings. It's the, I think there was less there than we wish there would be.
Lyndon Johnson.
Johnson, to me, was a fascinating figure. I actually met Johnson. I worked in the White House in the White House, press corps briefly while he was president. And I've read quite a lot of books about Johnson, and I don't have a simple answer. I mean, the elements are so mixed in Johnson that I think he's, in some ways, almost a tragic figure.
Jimmy Carter.
Carter, I think, is much better as an ex-president than he is as he was as a president. And I misread Carter at the time. I think the more I know about Carter, the more impressed I am with him.
Ross Perot.
Perot, I think, is an autocrat. I mean, I read him that way. I see him as a man who, if he could run he's very, he knows what's wrong, but the way he wants to fix it, to me, is very unclear. And I get the uneasy feeling with Perot that that he would like the country to be run either as a prison or as a monastery. I mean, he would be the abbot or the warden, and I don't think he has much sense of democratic debate.
Reagan taught the country that it wasn't necessary for a president to know anything about law or foreign policy or free speech or trees or black people or whales. Government was a salesman's smile and a gift for phrase. I think that's true of Reagan. I think Reagan was shrewder than many people thought, but I also think he was primarily an actor. He was a man who read a script, and what the words meant, I often think he didn't know, nor did he think it was important. Star Wars would be a wonderful example. I mean, he was on his way to a budget meeting, the first budget conference, the summit, and the night before, Jim Baker was then the Secretary of the Treasury. He had given him a briefing book. And they get in the limousine to go to the summit the next day, and Baker says to Reagan, well, did you have a chance to read the briefing book? And Reagan looked at him in horror and said, but Jim, The Sound of Music was on last night. I mean, of course he didn't have time to read it. I don't think he had time. I don't think he had to be especially well informed on those various heads. Where were you born?
San Francisco.
How long did you live there?
I lived there until I was about 13 years old, and then my parents moved to New York, and I came to New York and went to school, boarding school, and then to college in Connecticut.
What professions were your parents about?
My father had been first in the shipping business and then in the banking business.
What impact did Cambridge have on you?
Well, Cambridge showed me the difference between an American university education and English university education. I also formed in a... I learned to admire C.S. Lewis, who was then at Cambridge, and E.M. Forster was then at Cambridge. And so I was allowed into the presence of men whom I thought exemplary in many ways.
Were you concerned when you wrote this book that you were stepping on a lot of toes and that you might not be welcome in some places that you used to go to?
No, because the people who've writing a column, a monthly column for Harper's Magazine for a number of years, I've already stepped on quite a few toes, so that I don't expect any new doors will be closed.
Has there been any different reaction to this book, say, than that magazine? I mean, are people buying this book that don't normally buy Harper's?
I think so. I think so. I'm beginning to get letters from people who aren't familiar with what I've written, and it's very encouraging.
How's it selling?
I think it's selling quite well.
What's that mean to you? How many?
All that means is my publicist tells me that, or the publisher tells me that it's doing well, and that I don't know what that means, but presumably. And I also know that people go and ask for it in bookstores, and it's already been sold out, and they've had to order another 20 copies.
What's the circulation of Harper's?
210,000.
Is it making money?
No. Harper's last year had its best year, and since 1962 we only lost $67,000.
How long are you going to keep it up?
Well, I think we could keep up that loss for quite a long time.
How about you? How long are you going to stay the editor?
As long as I can get up in the morning and think that it's fun to go down to work.
Next book?
Next book is about Yale University.
When?
Published the fall of 1995.
Our guest has been Lewis.